Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a 737 pilot and member of PMDG's tech team. Today I'm going to explain to you how the VNAV system works in the Boeing 737. We'll start very basic. VNAV is vertical navigation and is the vertical part of the flight management system. All of you are familiar with lateral navigation, LNAV, which manages where the airplane goes, and VNAV manages how high it goes and how fast it goes. We have 3 VNAV pages in our FMC, and I'm going to go over them briefly for you here. So, the Vnf Climb page gives us a little bit of information. What is the next altitude constraint? When are we going to reach it? What is our cruise altitude? What is our target speed? Which speed restriction do we have in? And it gives us speeds for maximum rate or maximum angle for our climb, as well as an engine out prompt and required time of arrival function. Now, the interesting function of the Vnf Climb page for us are most certainly the target speed, so 280 knots and Mach 0.484 on conversion, since we have a rather low cruise altitude. Our speed restriction, which is usually 250 knots below flight level 100, but can be changed by the pilot. And then the maximum rate and maximum angle functions. Now, when would you use them? Maximum rate, let me select this for you here, gives us an airspeed that corresponds to the speed where we get the best rate of climb possible from our aircraft. And in our particular case, that happens at 252 knots and Mach 0.78 on conversion. Let me erase this. I'm going into maximum angle. That gives us the best possible angle of climb over the ground, which in our case is 224 knots and Mach 0.78 on conversion. And when either of those is selected or executed, like now, you can go back to the economy speed that's based on the weight and cost index and the wind information by clicking on the econ button. Next up, we have the cruise page. On the cruise page, we can see our target speed for the cruise. At lower altitudes, this is going to be rather slow. At higher altitudes, of course, faster. We can see the cruise altitude that we entered, as well as the optimum and the maximum flight levels for our flight. Next interesting information here is the Turbulence N1. So if you were to get into severe turbulence, where your airspeed is basically uncontrollable and unreliable, you would just set this N1 and then the airplane would more or less fly its turbulence penetration airspeed. Going up further, we have our economy descent page, the VNAV descent page. On here we have the end of descent altitude, and I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail a little bit later in this tutorial. And then we have our target speed, which is Mach 0.482 and on conversion 246 knots. And then we have a speed restriction that works similar to the speed restriction on the climb page, which is 240 knots and 10,000 feet. It also tells us how far it is to our top of descent, regardless of where we currently are. So that is very handy. If you are still climbing and you want to know, so how far is it to the top of descent? Just hit the descent page and you'll find that information there. Also part of it is the forecast page, in which we are giving the airplane essential information for our descent. Most importantly in that is the QNH and the wind forecast. So for the QNH, for example, you put 1023. And then for the winds, you can simply request them, and the airplane is going to have them for us. For the case of this tutorial, I am actually quickly going to enter something manually in here, and I can't overemphasize how important it is to correctly fill out the VNAV descent page. So, since we have a rather low flight, I'm just going to put the wind at flight level 100 in, which is 063 degrees at 5 knots. So 106/5. And actually it was 63 at 5. Here we are, and execute it. So that's what we have to fill out in here. What's also very handy is the thermal anti-ice on and off prompt, So in here, if you were to expect icing, for example, between flight level 100 and flight level 60, you would enter 100/60 in here. And the 737 gets quite a lot of additional thrust from the engine anti-icing system. That's why it's very important to fill this out if icing conditions are actually expected. So that concludes our quick review of the Vnaf pages that we have available for us. Now let's go ahead and actually go flying. I'm not going to go into very much detail about how to do the takeoff using Vnaf, because I have covered that in a separate video, so have a look there. Now, on this video, the focus is not going to be 100% on just the SOP and everything, but I'll focus on explaining the Vnaf system for you guys. So, let's go ahead, take off. Takeoff thrust set, indications normal. $80 knots. V1, rotate. And gear up. Positive rate. Right, let's put the autopilot on so that we can watch Vnaf at work. Of course, we could see the same if we were to use only the flight directors, but it is a little bit easier to make this happen with the autopilot. Especially if we want to have the capacity to do some explanations. So, now Vnaf starts accelerating the airplane, and we do have a few restrictions along our route. So, that leads us to the first explanation, and that is Vnaf speed mode in the climb. Basically, Vnaf speed works the following way. It sets the thrust appropriate for the phase of flight. So, for example, we are going to get the climb limited thrust for our climb phase over here, which we can see up on the engine display where it says climb 2, and we can see our engines are producing 85% of thrust. And now it is going to pitch the airplane in order to maintain the desired airspeed, or to accelerate to the desired airspeed. Vnaf speed mode therefore works very similar to the level change mode, but there is a small difference. And that is that Vnaf speed is going to take care of any restrictions that we have in the legs page of our flight plan. So right now we have 220 restriction over Delta Mike 066, and now that we're overflying the waypoint, it is going to accelerate further towards 250 knots. What you will also notice is that I've set the MCP to an altitude of 14,000 feet, and in the flight plan I have a constraint at flight level 70 at flight level 100. Now, as we approach flight level 70, the airplane is going to level off automatically there until it overflies Delta Mike 064, and once 064 has been overflown, it is automatically going to resume the climb towards the next higher restriction or the next higher MCP altitude. Right now, it's transitioned into Vnaf path mode, and Vnaf path is actually the mode that captures the flight level 70 and maintains it now. Once we're going to overfly Delta Mike 064, it will change back into Vnaf speed and then resume its climb. Together with the change into Vnaf path, we've also got the change in the auto throttle FMA into FMC speed. FMC speed basically indicates to us that the airplane is following the speed restriction from the FMC page. And we can see that speed restriction in magenta on the climb page over here, so it's 250 knots below flight level 100. And that is what the airplane is following. Be aware that when you are using speed intervent to use the speed from the MCP while you are still in Vnaf mode, it is still going to say FMC speed for you. And that's because the sequence of events is the speed goes from the MCP into the FMC, as you can see here, target speed 250/MCP, and then to the auto throttle system. So I'm closing the speed window again. Now that we've overflown Delta Mach 064, it went back into N1 mode to set the desired climb N1 and into Vnaf speed to pitch in order to maintain the 250 knots. It is normal that when you transition between those modes that the airplane is going to accelerate a little bit. Another feature to be aware of is the altitude intervent button. You can see now we have flight level 100 as the next constraint, but let's say our traffic control cleared is above that. Then, with our MCP altitude selected above the constraint, we are pressing this alt intervent button over here. That deleted the restriction, and now the airplane continues to climb without having to level off there. Next up, as we're passing flight level 100, that is our speed restriction, the FMC down here. We are going to start the acceleration from the climb speed towards the, or from the speed restriction towards the target speed. And right now you can see it transitioned into the Mach 0.484 mode over here. Now why is that? Basically, it's aiming for the target speed in indicated, so 280 knots, but it will convert to the Mach number as soon as the indicated speed is equal to or greater than the Mach number. And that just happened over here. That's why it's now aiming for Mach 0.484, which we can see our speed bug showing now. What you will notice is that Vnaf is approaching the target altitude pretty much as fast as possible. Now it's just transitioned back into Vnaf path mode to start the level off at our cruise level of 140, but you can see how it's still using 3000 feet a minute. That's why it is important not just to blindly trust Vnaf to do what it's supposed to do, because it will do what it's supposed to do, and that's reach the cruise level as fast as possible. And that's why we have the 3-2-1 rule in question, and if you don't know what that is, I can very much recommend you a look at my climb tutorial video where I'm explaining all of this. Now that we've reached cruise altitude, Vnaf has done several things for us. First of all, it transitioned into the economy cruise phase, so we can see the active cruise level here and the target speed. And the FMA has changed again into FMC speed and Vnaf path, indicating to us that this is what the airplane is currently maintaining. We can change our cruise speed by several manners. Either we change our cost index, for example I've planned this using cost index 6. If we went cost index 30, the airplane is going to speed up. So I'm executing this change. You can see how it's now speeding up to a speed of 292 knots. We can override this manually by simply inserting a speed of, for example, 280 knots in here. Now, some of you will ask themselves, so what am I supposed to do when I get a speed restriction by air traffic control? Will I use the MCP with speed intervent? Or will I use the FMC, where I'm going to change the speed? And the answer to that is, we usually use the FMC to make these changes. So if you were in cruise and for example our traffic control will tell you to fly Mach 0.78 or greater, then you are just going to enter 0.78 in the FMC page, and that is going to give you a command of Mach 0.78. The advantage of doing that over using speed intervent is that the FMC is now updating all its calculations with the new speed, most importantly the optimum altitude, which is based on the speeds that you are flying. So if you were to use the MCP like this, then the optimum altitude calculation would still be dependent on what you have inserted in the FMC as your econ speed. Whereas when the speed window is closed and you are following the Vnaf speed in here, then the optimum altitude is computed based on the speed from the FMC. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Vnaf descent, because that is probably the most complex Vnaf operation that we have available. The path is calculated backwards. That means that the airplane is going to take its end of descent point, that you can see up here, ED altitude, and That is usually based on the runway waypoint if we have one available, otherwise from the missed approach fix in the FMC. In here we have a runway waypoint, runway 28, at an altitude of 1096 feet. And that is what our end of descent altitude in the FMC is now based on. From there it's calculating backwards. Let's give it some performance information. So we put our flaps in, and that is going to give us a speed restriction of Vnf plus 5 at the last waypoint before the runway point. However, that's a little bit slow for us, so we'll make this 180 knots. So now it has a fixed segment from the runway towards the final approach fix. In here we've got a hard 4000 speed restriction, altitude restriction, so it can't do anything there. It'll have to descend from 4000 to the end of descent altitude. But from OSNUP it can now calculate backwards. So it's looking at its profile, and the target is when you are below the flaps up speed. It wants to descend at approximately 2.6 degrees. And from the flaps up speed to your descent speed restriction, so in the deceleration phase, it wants to use approximately a 1 degree descent, resulting in usually around 500 feet per minute. So then it's calculating, alright, so if I'm in level flight, I can lose about 10 knots per nautical mile. And we can perfectly see that here. OSNUP 1 mile, and at the Charlie Fox, it wants to have 190 knots. Then it's calculating backwards, okay, so to decelerate to this speed, I have that profile, so that would give me this altitude at this waypoint. Okay, I have a 5200 above restriction. Does it comply with it? Yes, it does. We can check where it actually wants to be when we have above and below restriction by deleting that restriction without executing. You can see it wants to be at 5909. That complies with the 5200 above restriction, so it can do that. And that's how it's basically calculating its path backwards, and how it determines its top of descent. Now, to make this a little bit more clear, I'm going to delete all those speed restrictions that we have over here, so that VNAV can actually do its thing. So now, drag required after OSNUP, that is checked. It will get its drag because we are going to extend the flaps. What I'm also going to do, we can change the speed restrictions in here. And since we actually have a 250 knot restriction below 100 and not 240, let's put that one in. Similarly, we can change our target speed in the descent. But we have to be careful here, because it is always going to aim to maintain its Mach number until it reaches the indicated airspeed. That's why if you want to convert to a high indicated airspeed, you might have to change towards a high Mach number. Also, when we are missing our top of descent for whatever reason, because for example our traffic control might deny us our descent clearance, then we have to be aware that when we are high on profile, the airplane still calculates with the speed that you have inserted on the econ descent page. And what you can do here is increase your airspeed, and by increasing your airspeed on the VNAV page, it is going to recalculate the path, generally saying the faster you go, the steeper your path is going to get. Alright, so that concludes our idea of how VNAV is actually going to work in this descent. Now, there is one more function of VNAV that we have to talk about here, and that is the VNAV approach mode. Now, you are not actually going to get any indication if the airplane actually is in approach mode, other than if you open the speed window, so you press speed intervent, and the FMA stays in VNAV path while you are descending. So if you were in a descent, you open the speed window and it stays in VNAV path, then you basically are in the approach mode. Now, the airplane is automatically going to transition to the approach mode once flaps are extended, or once it passes the final approach fix. So that's just something for you to keep in mind here. And the VNAV approach mode is actually very useful for VNAV driven approaches where you are not using the integrated approach navigation capability. And some airlines still don't have IAN capability in their aircraft, so they are actually using VNAV all the way down. For further information on that, have a look at my non-precision approach tutorials. Now, we have a very long standard arrival over here that we could fly out. I am going to use a little bit of it just to explain to you how the VNAV speed and VNAV path modes are going to work in descent, but thereafter I'm going to give you a small demonstration of the direct 2. So, first of all, how do VNAV speed and VNAV path modes work in the descent then? Speed and path are the two modes that we have available to us. VNAV speed is actually the one in which, similarly to the climb, it is going to go to idle thrust and then maintain the target airspeed as indicated by the magenta bar by pitching the aircraft up or down. That of course gives us a descent with the engines constantly in idle thrust. However, it is not necessarily going to follow the path. Instead, it will still take care of any altitudes or speed restrictions as we have them in the flight plan. However, it might parallel the path to the above. If you are below your VNAV path and you're engaging VNAV mode, then it will go immediately into VNAV path and descend at 1000 feet a minute. Now the 737 is a slippery airplane, so be aware that when we are actually using those 1000 feet a minute, it might not intercept the path, because the path might very well be calculated at just, for example, 1200 feet a minute. Now, let's talk about the direct 2. If I'm inserting a direct 2 like I am right now, there is one big advantage in VNAV when we are descending. And that is, whenever a direct 2 is inserted, the aircraft is taking the wind and the temperature from the current position where we entered the direct and will update the VNAV path information with it. So, if we have data in the forecast page like we have here, flight level 100, wind 63 degrees at 5 knots. But now, if we were, for example, at flight level 100 and we inserted a direct and the wind was different from the forecast wind, which it usually is in real life, because the forecasts are never 100% exact. They are good, but not exact. So if we were to get this change, then the airplane would update its VNAV path calculation based on the present winds and temperatures. So that means that it is very good practice on the approach just to enter a direct to the current inbound waypoint. I'm going to show you that in a few moments when we have started our descent. And I'm going to show you how that is affecting the VNAV path calculations. Now, our arrival into Nuremberg here is calculated basically with a steady idle path descent. But what if we would have an altitude restriction that would give us a fixed altitude at one waypoint and then a fixed altitude at another waypoint behind it? Then we know there are two different ways how VNAV could react depending on the option installed by the operator. At present, PMDG only simulates one of them, that is the geometric path descent, but there are some chances that we might see the other one in a future update, so I am going to mention it here. And first of all, we have our geometric path descent. When it's following that, it is basically going to calculate the exact vertical speed that you'll need from that one waypoint to the next one. And then it's going to program the path to be a constant vertical speed path on the way down. And you might require thrust in order to maintain that path. The other way, that is not presently simulated, but that will be simulated shortly, is one where it actually would level off at the commanded altitude, draw a new top of descent, and then it's going to resume more or less a cruise flight until it reaches the new top of descent, and then it will continue on an idle path descent. Now that is a little bit dangerous, because air traffic control will expect you to continue the descent straight away when they have cleared you to a lower altitude and not to level off. So the pilot has to take good care of that. Next up, we're approaching our top of descent here, so I'm selecting a lower altitude on the mode control panel, like now, 7,000 feet. And as soon as we are overflying the top of descent, you'll see how the FMA is going to change into retard and then arm on the auto throttle, like it does right now. So now it's retarding our thrust levers towards idle, and at the same time it's staying in VNAV path because we're going to follow the path all the way down. So now you can see our target speed is 273 knots, which we are following over here, or which we are trying to follow, because it's still reducing thrust, which it does very, very gently, by the way, which is correct for the real airplane. Sometimes the pilot will just have to take the thrust levers and retard them himself in order to prevent the speed from going excessive. Well, I'm quickly going to use our speed brakes here in order to slow us back down towards the target VNAV speed. When we are reaching flight level 100, we have our speed restriction here, 240 knots below flight level 100. Now again, this can be changed by the pilot. And you can see those two green rings on the navigation display over here. Those green rings are basically indicating to you where the deceleration segment from our target speed to our speed restriction is starting. So shortly before Delta November 245, the airplane is going to pitch up and will maintain an almost level flight. I'm saying almost because it will go down at a couple hundred feet a minute, and then decelerate towards the new target speed. Within this deceleration segment, you can see the energy state of the airplane, because both the path and the speed bug are going to be updated in real time to reflect where the airplane is supposed to be. That is especially interesting on the speed bug, because you will be able to see if you are following the commanded deceleration schedule, or if you might be going a little bit faster or slower than what the schedule recommends. So when you're on the path and on the speed, everything's good. But if you are, for example, on the path but you're going 20 knots faster than the speed bug indicates, then that would be a good indication that you should use the speed brake to help the airplane slowing down. The 737 is a very slippery plane, so it is expected that you might need speed brakes from time to time, especially when the wind information is not correct. So we can see this happen right now. It's transitioned to a target of 240 knots that you can see on the Vnf descent page. And you can see how the speed bug is slowly going down while the airplane is decelerating. So this right now is exactly the situation that I talked about. The airplane is not slowing down as fast as we've expected. And we can see why that is. On the forecast page, we've entered a wind of 63 degrees at 5 knots, but we actually have a wind from 330 at 17. So we do have a slight tailwind component that makes it harder for the plane to slow down. And you can see how we're getting a little bit faster than scheduled. So I'm going to ignore that for now, because it's just a slight deviation, but you'll have to carefully consider if speed brakes might be necessary. So now that the actual wind is different from the forecast wind, let me show you what I talked about with the direct earlier on. We're just going to enter a direct to the next waypoint like this, and execute this, and now it's recalculating the VNAV path with the new wind data. So the airplane has just determined that it can still more or less follow the original path with the original speed. And of course we're getting a message here, steep descent after 459. That's because we have the level 80 restriction here. When you get a steep descent message, you will need the speed brakes once you have overflown this waypoint up here. That is copied, so we are expected to use our speed brakes on the way down. One more bit of useful information here. When we are in VNAV path mode and your speed is dropping below the target, which can happen, for example, when we have incorrect wind forecast in, then there is an underspeed margin which VNAV is going to tolerate. By default, that normally is... Right, MCP altitude set a bit lower. So by default, that underspeed margin usually is 15 knots, but it is airline customizable, and we can see that here in the FMC options, under the equipment options. When we are going further down here, we can set our underspeed within 5 to 15 knots. When we reach that underspeed margin, then the airplane is going to add some thrust and is going to start accelerating towards the target speed again. And when it reaches that, it's going to go back into idle to resume its planned descent. So let me do a quick and dirty setup for the ILS approach here at Nuremberg. And that is pretty much all we need. Now, a small difference here at the point I'm recording this between the PMDG and the real one. When we have a QNH forecast entered on the forecast page, and then we change our QNH from standard towards that entered value, then we should remain right on the VNAV path. That is something that's going to be covered in a future update. Right now, we'll just have to anticipate the change and correct for it accordingly. I'm using my speed brakes right now to do that and to bring it back to the 240 knots speed. So now we are approaching the deceleration point. And when we overflight, you will see the speed restriction in the FMC here change from 240/level 100 to our upspeed /flaps 1. And that is the airplane's command to start decelerating towards the flap speed. Now, here's something very important that has changed with the recent update of the VNAV module in the 737. Once the upspeed is reached, it is going to resume about a 2.6 degree descent. And that 2.6 degrees will cause an acceleration of your speed. So when you reach the flap speed, you are expected to take the flaps out to help the airplane with a continued deceleration. So we are reducing the speed right now. I'm using a little bit of speed brake to help it since we are above the target speed. Now let's go flap 1. As soon as the flaps are extended into the 1 position, the speed restriction changes over here, and it's now giving us the flap 1 speed, and the speed bug has moved down to the flap 1 speed. Now VNAV has also transitioned to the approach logic, so when I'm going speed interval, you can see how it stays in VNAV path, rather than going to VNAV speed that it would have done if it was not in the approach logic. So I'm arming the approach mode now. Actually, just quickly going to do a setup over here. So we've now captured our localizer, and VNAV is now bringing us in for a perfect continuous descent approach without having to level off at 4,000 feet. Here we go, glide slope capture. Missed approach altitude is going to be flight level 60, so that is set. And here we are now, established on the ILS approach for runway 28. That is basically the point at which VNAV is no longer doing something good for us, or basically not doing anything for us anymore. So I could just conclude the video over here, but I know how you guys love seeing me banging aircraft into the ground, so just for the sake and for the fun of it, I'll just keep flying down here and show you that landing as well. Flaps 5. I might as well just use this as a quick method of cross-checking all the rest of my flight deck, because I've been explaining all flight long without actually doing any proper setups or anything. That's what I told you in the beginning, that for this one I'm not going to follow SOPs exactly, but I'll just keep going down and having a little bit of fun on this one. Right, so approaching 4 miles, gear down, flaps 15. And flaps 30. Did you know that you can simply click on the flap detent over here and it's going to move the flap lever into that detent? Nice little feature, really. Alright, we hardly have any wind, so we'll just go VRF +5. So, let's have a little bit of fun then. I haven't set a minimum yet, so we're visual anyway. Ignore the glide stop deviation.
30, 20, 10.
And here we are. Welcome to Nuremberg Airport. Speed breakup, thrust burst normal. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like or a comment what I can do better, what you might have as additional information. And I would really appreciate, if you love my videos, a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link that you can find in the video description below. For now, thank you very much for joining. Hope you found this one interesting, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one. Until then, thank you very much, and have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this.